何が言いたいんだ、クラピカ。
何か見えるの？私たちには見えない何かが。
This is easily the best arc so far, and one thing that stuck out to me as being particularly amazing concerning this arc and, well, the entire series really, is how much is conveyed through subtext or through dialogue implicitly. Now, these words might sound boring, but trust me, it's actually really cool and I want to show you all why today. Everything in this manga, Hunter x Hunter, is driven by character and everything flows naturally from one scene to the next. Nothing feels contrived, and as a result, this arc held my interest and attention and never once let go. And so, the time has come for me to finish this incredible arc in the only way I know how, by giving you all my first impressions of, thoughts on, and blind review for the mysterious, the compelling, and the gritty Yorknew City. Okay, so remember the cliffhanger I left things on in the last episode? Yeah. Well, somewhat interestingly, this arc didn't at all proceed or conclude in the fashion I thought it would. Unlike most shonen that more often than not focus on action, predominantly towards its latter sections, this story had a surprisingly sparse amount of it. Though, with that said, it most definitely did have some, and it is, in my opinion, fantabulistic. A word I just made up now to effectively convey my enjoyment of it, and I will most definitely be talking about the action in a little while. However, more on the main plot side of things, as it's unfolding after the boys get apprehended, a happy surprise I was greeted by almost immediately was how interesting and fun the Phantom Troupe happens to be. There's a tremendous effort from Togashi in this material to communicate and, perhaps more importantly, characterize various members of the troupe. These aren't mindless red shirts, these are real characters with personalities, morals, wants, and even goals. Whether it be the calm but cool Nobunaga, who, by the way, has a name that, for whatever reason, without fail, reminded me every time I read it of the sound the mask Aku Aku makes in Crash Bandicoot. In addition to him, there's the creepily upbeat and cheery Shalnark, the sinister Phaeton, and the level-headed Paku, among many others. Point being, by the time I reached the end of this arc, I was fully familiar with all of these colourful characters, and yet, oddly enough, despite receiving most of the focus and dialogue perhaps in this entire section, their leader, Chrollo, still feels like an enigma to me. But more on that in a little while. The opening scene sports a heavy tension in the air as Paku, one of the Phantom Troupe, possesses the ability to read their minds once they are asked a question. Unsurprisingly, they try to ask about Kurapika, but interestingly, as has been made evident throughout this story by them consistently referring to him as, quote, Chain Dude, they actually don't have any idea what his real name is, and as a result, Gon and Killua legitimately have no idea who they're talking about. I swear, the tension that's built up during these scenes was spectacular. Whether it be that exchange trying to get information out of them, or Gon's naive expression when he sees Hisoka chilling out with the group, made all the more sweet by Killua effectively finding a way to hide that fact by pointing out that the girl sitting next to Hisoka was the one Gon beat in the arm wrestling contest. Little decisions and workarounds like that made this scene flow perfectly and maintain a tremendous tension throughout. However, with the conclusion of this fun scene, it became very clear what the troupe's goals currently are. To make sure that these two boys don't escape and eventually meet Chrollo, and for the troupe to get revenge on the Chain Dude for killing Uvo. What follows this scene are probably my two favorite scenes from this opening section. The first is an obvious one, and is Gon and Killua's escape from the watchful eye of Nobu. Stuck with seemingly no way out and taking the lead on this, Killua readies himself to give up his life for the sake of his friend, but Gon, never one to give up, amazingly repurposes the information he learned from earlier in this very arc concerning the forgery of antiques in order to escape this particular situation against Nobu. Again, this is a nice callback, but it once again highlights a fundamental struggle struggle for Killua's character. Despite wanting to give up on his past to move on from his family, those habits he learned there still cloud his mind, and had it not been for Gon in this instance, Killua would have convinced himself that there was no other way out of this situation apart from sacrificing himself. Now, that's a great scene and I don't want to take anything away from it, but that's only one of the two best parts of this first section. The second part, I think, is a lot better.
クロロールシルフル変わった名前ね。
仲間には団長と呼ばれてるけど。
何それ、もっと変。
So, this is a super interesting turn of events for a few reasons. First of all, we haven't really had a chance to see what sort of charisma or personality Chrollo brandishes. Secondly, there's this implication that he's now after effectively kidnapping the mob boss's daughter. And thirdly, he possesses the ability to steal other Nen users' abilities. Meaning, once he gets his fortune from Neon, he'll be free to use his fortune-telling ability to predict other people's future. And good lord, the reaction that he had to his own future's fortune was unexpected, to say the least. After all the talk about Chrollo and all the outlandish or extreme characters we've met in the troupe thus far, one thing that's really surprised me about him has been how meek and calm he appears outwardly. And as it happens, this choice was made to enhance the contrast once he does eventually start fighting, because the guy's an absolute beast. So, as I mentioned above, right, we haven't really had that much of a chance to see Chrollo perform or interact with many people thus far in the story. But that's about to change, for with every decision he makes, every sentence he speaks, or order he gives to his subordinates, it offers us as an audience a deeper insight into the warped mind of this chaotic and terrifyingly composed individual. Take, for example, the order he gives to the troupe to make a show of themselves. On top of the destruction they inflict on the town being disastrous with plenty of casualties, it's not the bombastic destruction that receives a big page spread in the manga. It's by no means the chaos that receives the focus from this sequence. Instead, it's the looming presence of one Chrollo as he peers down on his subjects from atop a skyscraper, loving every single second of what transpires beneath him. He is very much the orchestrator or conductor, playing his sinister instruments for an unwitting and defenseless society. And in the manga, this page is laid out specifically to draw attention to his hands, to create that comparison, and I love that. Furthermore, this blitz by the troupe on the city is chilling and graphic in its depiction of the troupe's horrid acts of murder, dismemberment, and decapitation. It also offers a much greater insight into the individual members that we've all heard speak and bounce off of each other conversationally, but now we get to see them fight together. The visuals are gruesome, and mixed into them are some truly chilling throwaway lines like Shalnark saying that his toy broke, referring to a grown man being manipulated by him, ultimately dying horrifically in the process. Overall, it's a great and effective set piece to familiarize ourselves with what I assume will be their main obstacle in the material to come, and to give us more reason to hope that our heroes can pull off the victory here. Now, obviously, all of this is happening outside, and as I mentioned in the last video, Zeno and Silva, Killua's patriarch figures, are both being hired to take out Chrollo. I mean, it makes perfect sense that the mob would have a retaliation of some description to this disaster and destruction, and a response they most definitely deliver. These are two supremely powerful and highly respected assassins and characters in this world, and to say that I was excited to see how the fight would unfold would be a massive understatement. Silva and Zeno versus Chrollo. It is finally time for the Zoldyck family patriarchs to shine, Killua's father and grandfather. Having only seen a glimpse of his father in the prior short-lived arcs, it's sort of surreal getting to see them strut their stuff now finally. And going into this, I was curious to see how capable they really were compared to a force we've been getting to know for the duration of this arc. And interestingly, before the fight begins, they actually give a lot of security personnel time to vacate the premises to spare their lives. They don't seem to hold any malice or indifference towards life. They seem to value it, which is kind of surprising given their line of work. And given that they're approaching a character that can steal powers, I think that's pretty interesting. From a visual standpoint, the flow of these panels in the battle between the three of them are handled masterfully and flows perfectly. At one point, I even felt as though the panels were actually moving, something I had only experienced before in Dragon Ball's manga. There's a soft but tense nature to the beginning illustrations, particularly on this extremely detailed rendering of Chrollo's face, that without delay shatters into a dramatic and frantic typhoon typhoon of combat matched perfectly by the sketchy line nature of the drawings, purposefully selling the intense panic of the situation. But what I found interesting about this sketchy, frantic nature of drawing is that the speed and power of their movements is offset by the respective composed facial expressions of the participants. In other words, I love how this scene is handled. I mean, Mr. Zoldyck uses a single strand of his hair to prevent a knife he was stabbed from poisoning his entire body, which is just one of those shonen tough guy acts that I can't help but laugh at. It's just ridiculous. Also, another thing, Chrollo mentions that 1/10 of a milligram of this particular poison is enough to paralyze a whale, which, okay, how does he know this? Is he a scientist, a marine biologist? Does he go around measuring what effects this poison has on the biggest creatures he can find? I mean, if that's true, I mean, it's pretty weird. The fight also helps to cement the two Zoldyck's dynamics, with Killua's father, Silva, being the clear frontrunner in terms of strength and agility, made obvious by his actions and by his constant checking on his father's physical status. Despite this, the grandfather Zeno, while lagging behind in those departments, still acts as a great support player for Silva, all the while brandishing a cunning and perceptive personality as he breaks down what sort of nen Chrollo's power system stems from. And by the way, the respect shown between this father and son is honestly frightening, with Zeno saying that at one point as he pins him down that Silva should land the killing blow on Chrollo, even if it kills him. And without hesitation, Silva accepts this. It was around this time that I realized this fight is doing more for these characters than an expository conversation ever could. There's just so much substance and meaning that colors the choices and actions carried out through this sequence. And speaking of colors, after seeing both the 2011 and 99 versions of this fight, I have to say that the fight was handled perfectly fine in 2011, but the classic 99 version delivered some of the best animation and storyboards I've seen from this entire series so far. And really, the 1999 version of this anime has been firing on all cylinders for the entirety of this arc. And even as it reaches its climax, it does so by being true to the characters in question. With us privy to the strengths of both Zeno and Silva, we observe that Zeno figures out the abilities of Chrollo faster than Silva, all the while Silva attempts the finishing blow because he is stronger. Everything leans into the respective character strengths, and as a result, in the space of just one fight scene, Togashi has taught me to love these characters and their dynamic. Tremendous writing. Now, this ending to the conflict I absolutely didn't see coming, and once again, it's a character-rich moment that does a ton of legwork for the Zoldyck family. Mere moments before the conflict ends, we see the aftermath of the strike landed by Silva as he receives a call from none other than his son, Illumi. What?
Oh my god!
Apparently, Illumi all of this time was contracted to take out all the Dons. And so, with all of their employers now terminated, Silva and Zeno go on their merry way without finishing the job on Chrollo once again. It's all business as usual and nothing personal. And what's more is, it's a great way of preserving all of these characters in a believable way. It's just so good! And the best part of the Illumi sequence at the end is that it facilitates the progression of the auction as planned, thus furthering the story and leaving Kurapika to pick up the pieces as he views the doctored or set up crime scene where Chrollo's corpse lays. But something I think that's worth mentioning at this time was one of the starkest differences brought to my attention between the two animated versions. It should go without saying that I am trying to be as objective as I can here, or as fair as I can, but at the end of the day, it's really all subjectivity. It's down to my tastes and your tastes clashing. So please don't leave with the impression that the 2011 version of this show is inadequate or isn't worth watching, as millions of people prefer this version or have nostalgia for it. It's great. With all of that said, however, I noticed that something seems to be somewhat of a trend when I compare these two versions, and that's how the respective anime adaptations try to capture a particular tone of a scene. After the fight reaches its abrupt ending and the auction concludes, Kurapika is shown walking carrying the eyes of his fallen clansmen. Now, even if I ignored that all the music used in 2011's version of this scene is laughable and does not at all match the tone of the scene, the visuals unfortunately do nothing for the scene either. Flat with strange textured shading and low detailed hair. And I understand that many people don't bother reading the manga or checking out older versions, and if this is your only exposure to this scene, then you might not notice, but I personally saw this right after reading the manga and seeing what 1999's adaptation did for the scene. Check it out.
どけ
ふざけん
やめておけ今の私に関わるな
Compare these two clips side by side and hopefully you'll start to get a sense of what it is that the 2011 version is missing in this instance.
puedo detenerme.
So Kurapika's walking around carrying some eyeballs and all sorts of upset because these Phantom Troupe members seem to be dead, even though we as an audience know that they're not. However, it did throw me off balance for quite a little bit while I was reading. Furthermore, the craziest thing about these guys is that they leave behind no sort of trail or breadcrumbs, no information to analyze about them, not even birth records, which apparently point them to being castaways from a certain place known as Meteor City. I'm guessing that will come into play later. This place accepts pretty much anything, but will not accept anything being taken away, which is an interesting precedent to set. I wonder if something will go there, and Gon will try to take it back, but he won't be able to. I feel like that's what they're setting up, but not 100% sure. But yeah, these apparently are the only rules that this place abides by, and thus the search for their identities seems to be at a dead end. In other words, we are currently dealing with forgotten or unwanted children that later became adults who became assassins eventually. Which, I mean, kind of makes them a tight-knit family group of sorts. Remind you of anyone? In other words, the theme of family continues to run strong in Hunter x Hunter. So strong, in fact, that even after Chrollo reveals that the spiders will lose half their numbers, they all assume that means that half of them will die, which again made me think, well, okay, technically speaking, the poem never said anything about death, just that the spiders group's numbers will be halved. In theory, someone or a bunch could just leave too. It's an interesting stipulation, but also, like everything else in this story, is written in such a way that reveals in this instance the familial bond they all share. No one even entertains the possibility of betrayal, which tells us more about their bond than a simple explanation ever could. And this scene, as they read their fortunes and eventually piece together what they must do to reach their goals, Chrollo confronts Nobu and in a way tells him to give his life to protect the others that are more important to their operation. And as perfectly timed as I've come to expect from Togashi, as Nobu agrees to lay down his life to change the prophecy, Hisoka betrays them all by secretly leaking sensitive information to Kurapika about them. A large component that acts as the foundation to this arc is Kurapika's suffering under the weight of his own conscience and sense of responsibility. There's so much negativity, hatred, and blood surrounding this poor character who, as I mentioned in last week's video, has already shown us that he doesn't take any enjoyment out of hurting people, let alone ending their lives. And thankfully, this upcoming section contains some long overdue and truly sweet moments. Finally, some happiness for Kurapika. Reuniting with Gon and everyone, he smiles for what feels like the first time in ages. The band is finally back together. However, once Kurapika meets up with everyone, he lets it slip that he's the chain dude they were speaking about, and because Killua's character is hella consistent, he freaks out and reprimands Kurapika for giving them that information, because he knows there's a girl on the Phantom Troupe team that can read minds, and will read minds. I love all of these little moments and character consistencies. Whenever there's a potential combat situation or whenever he's dealing with a foe, Killua always seems to have his head screwed on for the next logical thing to do. Well, for the most part. He sometimes needs help from his friends. With all of that said, however, because of this development, the plan is to go on the offensive now. They still need that reward money for Greed Island. We then switch scenes to Chrollo dishing out all the troops' fortunes back at the hideout. I liked it, but to be honest, this was where I encountered something in the manga that I didn't like. And it's not the first time this sort of thing has happened either in this material. With these sections offering tons for me to enjoy, like the insight it offers into the dynamics of the various troop members, and while also pulling double duty with some tasty dramatic irony with Hisoka being the traitor in the group. You know, it seems like a scene I should love unconditionally, and I almost would if it wasn't for Togashi's desire to overly explain something in a really clunky manner sometimes. I've spoken at length over the last month about how effective Togashi can be at serving up exposition in creative and seamless ways, whether it be through the decisions the characters make, what they say or don't say to each other, or even through their own desires, but this doesn't happen here. During this scene, Hisoka quickly replaces his fortune, thus hiding his true intention of trying to fight Chrollo, and this is a perfectly fine and creative situation using Nen, but Togashi, much like his explanation for how Hisoka dismantled Castro back at Heaven's Arena, is bogged down in so many specific and explicit expository dumps that it honestly feels a bit like school, and it kind of feels like someone's lecturing me. These sort of explanations are present in a lot of different anime and stories, but these two specific examples in Hunter x Hunter felt overly bloated and complicated for what was actually being explained.
Bungee gum contains the properties of both rubber and gum, you see.
I feel like this is one of those instances where less is more and he shouldn't need to hold our hands through everything. Unfortunately, ultimately, as I mentioned in the prior video, this was what I was worried about when Nen was explained. There are so many wonderful upsides to a more complex and involved power system like Nen, but this is just one of the seemingly inevitable downsides. More complicated things can't really be explained easily without first divulging a ton of information onto the reader to act as an explanation. But yeah, that's probably the only instance where I thought the plot struggled during this portion of the arc, and it's all upticks from here on out. So, we're finally heading into the endgame of this story, and again, this breaks the tradition of normal shonen stories, in a sense. There's no earth-shattering or even city-shattering ramifications to this looming altercation between the two groups, but we are heavily involved because we know who's involved and what's hanging in the balance for them. It's gripping stuff. Kurapika explains his ability with the chains in detail to the guys, and together they make a pact, one that bonds them using his chains to a certain promise. It's sort of screwed up, but also kinda touching to see them as close friends yet again. Killua goes to scope out the place, but a bunch of Nen buildings have been erected by one of the troupe, thus making them next to impossible to find. However, it's here something interesting comes to my attention. Killua and Melody tail Chrollo's group, right? And during this scene, I thought it was fun to see how powerful Melody's hearing really was, and how the use of it makes her notice how quiet all of Killua's steps really are. She even asks if he's an assassin. It's an interesting character moment, and I honestly thought that was a really subtle but interesting piece of character interaction. Someone like Killua that has quite literally refused to follow in his father's footsteps still can't help but walk with them out of habit. And it's that sort of attention to detail that makes this a phenomenal series. I mean, earlier in chapter 107, there's a conversation between Gon and Killua, wherein Killua remarks that because the world thinks that these folks are dead, that there's no real point in continuing to pursue them, considering there's no reward so that they can get closer to Greed Island. And this interaction, I think it's a really easily missed moment, but it's one of my favorite interactions from the entire arc, and I'll tell you why. Because this line by Killua mirrors almost perfectly how his father and grandfather handled the Chrollo situation when they were facing him earlier in the arc, wherein they let one of the most dangerous men in the world go because it was just business. There was no profit for them. With their bosses dead, they had no incentive monetarily anymore. And this is exactly what Killua is doing with Gon at this moment in time. However, unlike his father and his grandfather, Killua has a friend to help him to continue fighting for reasons outside of business. These are dangerous people, they are going to do horrible things, and right now, it seems Gon has a plan to get the Greed Island game while still pursuing the Phantom Troupe in the first place. As mentioned prior, this arc really doesn't have impactful stakes that affect a large scope of people. In fact, the scope is remarkably small. And I say remarkably small because I really care. I'm invested. I want to see how Kurapika's story comes to a close or resolution, and I want to see Gon meet his father for the very first time. It's a long journey with plenty of unexpected twists and turns, and this is another one of them. With Gon and Killua both captured by the troupe, the new plan becomes try to find a way to avoid too much information being leaked now that they know so much more than they did the last time, and this girl has the power to read minds with a single touch, so they better beware. But even more worrying, Killua and Gon now have no communication with anyone. Well, almost no one. One of my favorite characters had an elegant solution to this problem. Killua begins to whisper to himself, hoping that Melody hears him, and then, as if by magic, this happens.
My crotch! My crotch! Hey, has anybody seen my crotch lately? You little puke. One of these days I'm gonna catch you, and I'm gonna carve my name on your back with an ice pick.
I love Leorio, and I don't use the word love very often, but this is such an elegant, beautiful solution to this unique problem. Nen is awesome, and now we have a plan. They will wait until 7, the power will cut, and then Killua will attack in the confusion. And the way this plan is laid out in the manga is honestly just beautiful. It's brilliant. I love the choice Togashi made to use the radio in the hotel lobby to act as a countdown of sorts to when the lights will eventually cut out. I love that we as an audience are made fully aware of the plan beforehand and therefore anticipate it all the more, thus raising the tension, particularly when the lady that can read minds touches them. It's amazing, and the small brawl that ensues after the lights cut is brilliant, with Killua acting like the monster he knows how to be by breaking her arm, all the while Gon follows up the attack with a massive kick to her face. And despite them being recaptured after the initial flurry, something comes to the attention of the group. Something really important. Chrollo has vanished amidst the chaos. It's a solution that facilitates this exact incident without the secret surrounding Kurapika being spread beyond this woman. For if she tells anyone, Chrollo dies. This arc really has just done so much for Kurapika as a character. The precautions he lays out, the toughness of his persona, the determination he brandishes, the cold-blooded nature he is conducting the phone call with, and abducting Chrollo has been nothing short of stellar. It's incredibly cathartic watching as these spiders slowly figure out that Kurapika really does have them wrapped around his finger as he forces their hands and sends them all back to their hideout, leveraging Chrollo's life when utilizing Melody's power and luring the mind-reading girl to the desired location alone. There is one small issue, however. Chrollo isn't remotely unnerved, and Killua and Gon are still with the Phantom Troupe. Eventually, though, an exchange is made, and through this exchange, we actually get to see the discussions and arguments erupt amongst the troupe. These aren't putty monsters from Power Rangers or some random goons. These are all real characters, and while they have a common goal, they have different philosophies, and seeing how these mindsets and approaches clash and respond to this unique situation was fascinating, reinforcing not just the bond between them, but with the audience too. They feel like a family. These are incredibly compelling characters, made all the more incredible in this arc's conclusion. Typically speaking, as a reviewer of these Japanese stories, I choose to read the manga first as that's the primary source. It's the closest I can get to the author's true intention for the scene. That's not to say I dislike anime. I love anime. I don't have anything against it, and I think it can be brilliant if done correctly. But just like anything else, it can be done incorrectly. Hunter x Hunter is in a rather unique position where it has been afforded by the anime gods 2 separate anime adaptations, and throughout this series I've pointed to numerous instances where I felt like the anime failed to capture the true essence of certain scenes, whether that be down to the music, the animation implementation, or even the direction at times of a scene. And let me make something perfectly clear, Hunter x Hunter isn't the only story that this happens with. It happens with almost every anime, even some of my favorites. Take this scene from Dragon Ball Z after Goku deals the finishing blow to Frieza. He looks down towards the crater with disdain. I mean, who doesn't remember that moment who's seen the series? It's a very iconic shot, so anyone who's a fan of Dragon Ball would be very much familiar with that scene and think they understand what's going on here. Or so you would think if you only saw the anime. You see, in the manga, this scene has one subtle difference, and this subtle difference changes the entire scene. In the manga, after dealing what he thinks is the finishing blow to Frieza, Goku is left with this look across his face. There's no disdain, there's not even really anger. There's just pity and sorrow. This is why reading the manga first is so important to me. It's just to get the most accurate interpretation of the events, and then I can look at the anime afterwards. However, there is an instance in this portion of Hunter x Hunter that I can't help but draw attention to and point as being absolutely incredible here and now. Throughout these last 4 videos, I've been comparing 2 separate adaptations as well as the manga. One from the 90s and early 2000s, known as the 1999 anime, and one from the last 10 years, known as the 2011 anime. And this arc, this video, is where the older, crisp version of the show ends in a spiritual sense. But what an ending they deliver. There's a scene towards the end of this arc where, after delivering the kids back to Kurapika, Pakun resigns herself to death in exchange for delivering unto her teammates the necessary information using her nen. The manga's version is great and 2011's is perfectly faithful to that, but 1999's version of this death scene is the most incredible of their adaptations in this series, bar none. And this is what, in my opinion, any and every anime adaptation ought to strive for. The artwork and direction is top tier stuff, taking precisely what made the manga's scene great and elevating it to new heights using the strengths of this medium. It's chilling, it's emotional, and it left me with my jaw on the floor. It's stunningly beautiful. It's as close to perfect as I can imagine a scene adaptation can be. Now, there's a little more to this arc, like Hisoka looking for someone to fight, but then realizing that he can't fight Chrollo, and eventually how we desert Chrollo on top of a mountain somewhere awaiting his crew. But honestly, it's near impossible to beat that scene with Paku. It's just so good, so I'm going to leave it with that scene because honestly, it deserves it. Over the last month, I've come to appreciate the 1999 version of the story quite a bit, and it's not going to be the same without it moving forward in its current glory. And so, while with the closing of this video, I'll be closing the book on Yorknew City and starting starting my new journey on Greed Island next week, in this video I'll also be closing the book on a tremendous adaptation of a phenomenal story, capping off its run with one of the most stunningly tragic and magnificent scenes I've ever seen in an anime. And just like everything else in this story, it's still ongoing. Gon's next objective is to acquire the Greed Island video game, and I can't wait to see what more is to come as we catch up with this amazing story. But that'll have to be left for next week. But until then, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date, and if you enjoyed this series, let me know by leaving a like and a comment down below. See you all on Greed Island next week.